Okay, so we are going to start with this little seminar on figure drawing, gesture drawing, whatever you'd like to call it. Not all figure drawings are gesture drawings, but usually getting the gesture of a figure down is pretty important, especially if you're doing a quick set of figures. That's sort of like the information that you wanna put down onto the page, and especially if you have 30 seconds to put information down into the page. Getting sort of like the quick gesture down is definitely the most efficient way to have something that portrays at least the correct energy for the pose that you're going for. So I know that a lot of people don't like gesture, they struggle with gesture, it's really daunting, they don't like class settings where there's a bunch of like very short gestures, because obviously it's a little rush, it can be pretty tough. And here's why I think everyone hates gesture, or most of the people that I've talked with, why they don't like it. I've found that people who are sort of like scared or have a distaste for getting gesture down, first of all, struggle knowing what the point of the exercise is, or exactly like what are the tools that they have to represent the figure in a certain way. And the second thing that I find is that they are not satisfied with the results. My dog in the background also does not like gesture. They're not satisfied with the results. And especially when it comes to those very fast 30 seconds figures. In all honesty, it is my belief that the 30-second figures, even the minute figures, and like the 2 or the 2 or 3 minute figures, it is a warm up, so that you can sort of like warm up and like loosen up your line work, be a little more confident with this type of mark making that you are making in your art. And the reason for this is because traditionally classes where you have gesture drawing are done in an atelier or a workshop setting where an artist is standing in front of, usually it's an easel, sometimes it's some other type of contraption, and you are meant to draw in a pretty big on the page, and usually the figure, the model, will switch, will do very dynamic poses that will be switched pretty quickly. And the idea is that by doing a lot of these, you are able to develop certain. There are two things that you develop. Something that happens immediately, and then something it gets trained throughout time and repetition of like gesture classes. The immediate benefits of doing a batch, let's say, of quick figures is immediately, because you cannot be precise, you are forced to somewhat have sort of like bigger, quicker, flowing gestures, right? So when you can't think, when you have little time, you have to make big decisions, and you have to try to represent either the most accurate or the most important idea of the figure, or as much as you can in those 30 seconds. So it helps you prioritize what the main concept for the figure is. For example, if there's like a bend on the body or a twist in the body, or something is being held, or something like that, you know, if there's an interesting angle, if there's a line of motion, it helps you identify and focus on the main specific idea of the pose, instead of getting lost in the details. And this is something that I always like to repeat, which is you will have a much more successful product, and you will have an easier way going through the drawing process if you start with the most general of ideas, and then as you work on the piece, you start going from the most general concepts to the most to the details, or the most specific concepts, because it helps. It is a gradual foundation to ornament or detail workflow, and it works really well, because once you make sure the foundation is strong, or the foundation is clear and it's there, usually whatever you add on top of that foundation, not only are you not trying to build something with a foundation that is sort of flaky, but if you add details on top of something that is strong, they will usually read in a way that is very accurate. It's going to be easier. When you are building a house, you start by the cement and the bricks and whatever, and you're not just hanging panes of glass in midair. So those are the immediate benefits. You are loosening up your body, because a lot of drawing in front of an easel is knowing it, sort of like loosening the muscles in like your shoulder and your elbow, because you're usually drawing from the shoulder or drawing from the elbow. You have this, when you have a big piece and you want flowing, confident lines, you are going to use the pivot in your body that is the allows for the most fluid line or motion. So it is that quick change in and sort of like a little bit of a panic while you are working through many very quick sketches that allows you to loosen up. It's a warm-up, but it is both a mental and a physical warm-up, because there are a lot of sort of mental stiffness when you are working on a piece. And you will usually find that panic that comes from having a blank canvas sort of starts to disappear, because you've already drawn 15 figures and they have whatever, they are either good or bad. It sort of doesn't matter at this point. Because you are sort of like loosening up and losing that fear, because you just had to sort of go through so many things. And the long-term benefits of doing this kind of exercise, not only is it good to you sort of start understanding, immediately you are looking at certain components of the pose, such as like the general gesture or the line of motion, and you develop that when you look at a reference. You're also becoming more confident and becoming less precious with your art, and becoming more accustomed to error and a product that you may not be satisfied with. And why is that important? I think that personally, I think that frustration is one of the biggest problems or obstacles that artists face when they are producing a certain type of they are aiming to have some type of output. And there is of course you are going to get better as you practice. However, it is important that you build a resistance or a tolerance to frustration and the kind of output that you may or may not have. And you can you can sort of like make peace with the fact that you may draw 20 figures and none of them are gonna look not even good. Some of them may not even look like people, because when you have 30 seconds to put lines down, the first times sometimes the 20th time it doesn't look like someone. And it's very important that artists build a tolerance towards frustration. And eventually, when you have that tolerance towards frustration, you stop getting frustrated, and you understand that there are going to be things that you produce that aren't up to your personal standards, and that is okay, and it's part of life. And the more you accept that, the better time you have drawing, and then you start enjoying the process of drawing instead of the results of drawing, basically. And when you do that, you draw more and you get better, basically. So whenever I hear from artists that they don't understand what sort of what the idea is from this sort of exercise, it's not only the anatomy. Of course, like, it's the anatomy, right? Like, technically, you have like anatomy, shade, gesture, line work, figure analysis. A lot of things are getting trained, but you're also training, pumping out a lot of work, and being okay with whatever it looks like. That is why there is no pauses between, well, I mean, for the model to rest most of the time. But if you're doing it online, for example, there are some very good websites like Line of Action, and others that I will probably send in a little while, that have these class modes where you have the 30 seconds and then the picture shifts and then you have 30 seconds, and the important thing is you move on. It doesn't matter if it looks absolutely terrible, the last one. You move on to the next one, and you move on to the next one, and on to the next one, and to the next one, and then you start getting the hang of it. And it's usually done incrementally, so that you have sort of like that warm up. And when you get more time, it's like, okay, I have so much time. When you get to like the 10 minutes, and some people do then like 30 minutes, it's like, oh my god, I have a lot of time. I need to actually sit down and think about what I'm going to do. Otherwise, I'm gonna have a piece that's like sort of done at the minute mark, and it's not quite going to be like well observed. So that is mostly, those are some of the reasons why I think people really don't like this sort of exercise. Some people really like it. You may be here listening to this and you may really like it, but usually when I ask people, they're like, oh my god, please don't! Because you have to deal with that frustration and then like moving on immediately, and you're like, oh my god, the last one really looked horrible. In fact, like I have like my own on screen, and I really don't like some of these, and I don't think they're successful. And some others I sort of like enjoyed, but some of the first ones I'm like really like, okay, oof. I could have done so many things. I could have made choices that are better, that are more interesting, that better portray the pose. but it doesn't matter because the 30 seconds are over and that's it. Or, 30 seconds and then like the minute and like the 2 minutes and the 5 minutes and then the 10 minutes are done and it's fine. You move on. Being too precious about the things that you make can be, and by being too precious, I mean putting a lot of like your self-worth on a single thing that you make. It's going to be complicated because you're gonna make a lot of stuff that you're probably not gonna like. So at some point it's important that you shift from trying to enjoy the end process, because a lot of times you're not gonna enjoy the end. You're not gonna like the end product, even though it may like objectively be really good, because artists are very self-critical. But if you're able to enjoy the process, then everything gets a little bit easier. And gesture drawing is pretty fun once you get the hang of it. So the next thing that I want to talk about, the main thing that people are taught when they think about figures, which is whenever you have a figure, you have to find the line of action, and the line of action is a curve. And here is why I find that a little bit problematic. I'm gonna be using references from two stock providers. I'm gonna be using reference from Adorka stock, formerly Senshi stock, and then I'm gonna be using stock from the Post archives, and I'm gonna be later on linking all of their websites so that you can check them out. They're really good. They have a lot of reference. You've probably seen their work before. And they're super nice, and they allow like teachers to use their content for teaching, and I think that's very generous. So, for example, line of action. And here's why I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding as to what line of action means. A lot of times when you hear line of action, and what I usually see students do is that they think of the line of action as a curve or as a single curve. And that can be a little bit problematic because there are a lot of curves within the anatomy that are opposite of each other, right? So, for example, if I were to ask about what sort of curve this entire pose represents, some of you may tell me it's this curve right here, because you have sort of like she like the weight is right. This is the most weight bearing leg, and then this person is leaning forwards, right? So that would be the line of action. But that's also, and I understand. It makes sense physically that this may be the line of action, but some people may also say there is a clear upturning of the shoulders here and a bend to the spine like this. So that is completely opposite to that line of action here. But my line of action that I'm drawing here, it doesn't really like account for the legs. The legs just don't fit that direction, so that's a little bit weird, right? And then a lot of people say, well, you use the line of action that you think portrays the pose the best. And then some other people say, well, you can use an S shape for the line of action. So maybe you have this and then you have this, right? And I think this is sort of like the most accurate descriptor of this pose. But there are still things that I think could be improved on. Either way, The line of action is an exaggeration of the gesture, and there are some gestures and some poses that are gonna be, especially when there's an arc back and then the legs are raised, where you're gonna have more complex shapes that are gonna be able to be represented with a C shape. You know, you can have an S shape, and usually when it comes to the line of action, I like to think about the rhythms I like to think about the rhythms, and I like to think about the forces that are taking place and are being exerted onto the body or that the body is doing. So sometimes line of action can be a little deceiving, or can be hard to find, and there can be some cases and some poses where it's not. There are other things that can be a lot more successful, I think, in indicating what is happening within the body. And that is where we get to the concept of rhythm, right? Gesture and rhythm. So the thing about rhythm, a lot of people don't understand what rhythm is, and the thing about art is that so many different artists use so many different words, and they sort of like use terms in you know, I forgot the word in English, but they exchange words and that sort of thing, and they call two different things the same thing, or the same thing to different things. But it as always, it depends on the author that you're reading. But there's this notion of rhythm and this notion of force, and usually when we talk about rhythm, there are two. It's the same thing, but there are two ideas about rhythm. First is that rhythm is the relationship between and or a chain of curves and straights, right? And straights and curves. And the second notion, that is the notion that I like the most from an author that I really, really like. And his name is Mattesi, author of Force, that I think is like the most important book that an artist can read when they're gonna tackle a human body, or anything for that matter. He talks about rhythm as being sort of like the interplay between forces. So in his case, you're gonna have two curves, and there's gonna be, or more, and there's gonna be a sort of like a play, an interplay that is sort of like gonna be a little zigzaggy between these, and that is going to provide that idea of visual rhythm, right? Like tack, 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 tack. And I personally find this to be the most successful, or the most, like, I don't know, that's just the method that works the best for me. And the curve and straight concept is also pretty interesting. It's used a lot in simplification and exaggeration, and rhythm is used a lot in animation. I always tell my students that if they want to understand rhythm and ways to simplify the body that are gestural and are loose and are beautiful, to please go and study sketching for animation. Like, it can be like the golden era for Disney, it can be like DreamWorks. If you get those rough passes that are super, super lively for animation, you will find a lot of information that is super, super, super interesting. And I personally think rhythm plays a huge part in shape design, and I think that shape design plays a huge role in producing something that is aesthetically pleasing and that is fun to look at, and many other things. So, how do we find the rhythm in this here pose, right? Well, when Mike Mattesi talks about force, he talks about the different forces that are that come to play within the body, and or that the body's exerting onto something, or that is being exerted onto the body. And you usually have, you know, gravity, tension, torsion, that sort of like all of that physics stuff. And for example here, right, and a lot of times he tells you to adopt the pose that you want to draw and or that you're copying, and you can feel this tension and this sort of like force in the body. And it's sort of like, it's just a lot of people when they're drawing an expression, they make the expression, and sort of like it helps them sort of like gauge where the tension is within the face. Same thing, you have to imagine you're sort of making this shape, right? And if you are making this shape, where you would feel like a pull or a push. And the main thing here, the main idea of this pose, I feel, is the lean. So we're gonna have clearly this hip, the hip and the chest to shoulder area are the biggest two masses in the body. So that is always a good thing to start with, instead of like starting, you know, with the fingers or the feet, or, you know, sometimes you don't want to start with the head. So first of all, we have this sort of like lean, or that pop up of the hip that's angling to the side, and then you have this with the shoulder sort of like the opposite curve here, and these two are interacting within each other. And if you see this, it is quite similar to this, right? So we are going to find that curve. I think a lot of times Ramon Hurtado calls it like flesh braid when it's found inside of like when the pattern is found in the limbs. And because this sort of, just like a fractal, this sort of interplay between forces is found in the macro and micro of micro, I guess, of the body. So you can find this relationship between shapes in the entire body, and then you can find them in a limb, and then you can find them like in the smaller structures, and it's pretty beautiful. And you will find it pretty easily in limbs that are asymmetrical, such as like the leg. The leg is very symmetrical, the arm is very symmetrical. So we have this, right? So what I would normally do if I saw this pose in the wild, right, I would immediately go for the torso and the hip, right? Torso and the hip, and then of course sort of like the belly's pulling up, and you have this beautiful break, right? And it's called a break. It's called like to break your arm when in posing and in photography, you sort of like have this, and it would also read like this. And almost always, unless you're like really curving your back the other way, when you have the hip, the back has like a completely has the opposite rhythm. And then you have like the rhythm of the belly and the chest, and it pulls like this. So we have that usually. But basically what you emphasize is up to you as an artist. There are things to emphasize that some people would say are like objectively more important in a pose, but I'm not really like a huge believer of absolutes. So we'll have this, and then you can have this here, right? And usually we work sort of like in opposites, like here, 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 here. There is, for example, a lot of people, whenever people draw legs, a lot of people just like go smaller at the knee and then just go here. And as you may know, there is an asymmetry, as I just talked, within the leg, right? You have the hip, and then in the inside you have this, right? The inside of the knee is sort of like this big curve, and that's also because there is like a little, like in the anatomy there is a pretty tight muscle here that sort of like divides like over the quadriceps, like that. I forgot the name, but it's sort of like a little string, right? So you will normally like have this, and it will interplay with either like the hip or the thigh or whatever. There we go. And then opposite and flowing out of this curve, you will have here this outside shape. And when it comes to the inner muscle, for example, of the leg, you have a short muscle here inside. You have a short muscle, and then you have a straight line. And you have a straight line. There we go. Right? So, and then you can, of course, like add like the flowing lines of some of the bends in the body if you're gonna add like the rib cage, right? But the idea of gesture is the shapes flowing into each other, like, as you can see, like in the leg. So you can have this super flowing idea of the body here, right? And there we go. And then we have sort of like the gesture of the head, I would say, that is sort of there. So this would be the main information that I would like to have here, like in this pose. Like if I see it, that's the main. And then of course, like you have the feet are pretty hard, but usually you can flare them out a little bit. Flare them out like using the angle of the top of the foot, like that. But I'm also not a foot expert in it by any means. So basically we start with the most important masses and we follow the rhythm, and then we have something that has a lot of like that idea of gesture, and it's pretty, there's not a lot of details, but as always you can add that. You can add that later, definitely. Something that I always like to account whenever I look at a figure is I check if the knees are level, I check like if the hips are level, I check out like if the, if the joints are level, because if they're not, we're gonna have something called contrapposto, and that is pretty interesting to represent. You can also argue that this is a curve here. So yeah, the more you can find curves, and these are exaggerated, of course, but the more that you find things like this, the more lively and the more flowing you're finding sort of like the hidden secret geometry of the structure of the body. And then whenever you draw, and like if you have like, sometimes it's good to like do an exercise like this, but instead of limiting the time, you limit the amount of lines. So like if you have 5 lines, you're probably gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 or something like this, like. And then you can try again and try to have like. Try doing different lines and see what like looks like the figure the most, and that's pretty interesting. So that is basically a rhythm. You can find it in everything that is not machine made. what I mean is, like, for example, if you have like a cylinder, like something that is like perfect and perfectly asymmetrical, and there's straight lines and there's no curves and there's no asymmetry or organic or components to it, it's probably gonna be pretty hard to find a like natural rhythm in it. And of course, like, the body can sort of like disarticulate in like any sort of like position. So very, very useful, very useful thing to think about when you're thinking about drawing figures. Here we can see some more of what I was talking about. Let me also, like, as always, for the love of God, find diverse people, please, to do studies of. So here we can see very well that you have that interplay, right, in the curve of the back and the curve of the hip that you almost always find, especially when the spine is gonna be arched like this, right? You're gonna have that. And sometimes you can get the hip and all of this in a single stroke, right? Gonna do that a little more transparent so that you can see it. Wonderful. You're gonna get all of that, right? And then we can see that we can almost get like all of this in like a single line that sort of like push. And this is something that I always see with the limbs. People treat all of the limb as something completely. They break the limbs apart in a lot of different shapes. And if you have something like this, right? I'm angling to get my best angle for the curve. And you have a curve like this, there is a shape that just goes through the entirety of the lower arm. And you can do that. You don't have to. If you think too much about the contours of the body, you're probably gonna lose a lot of like interesting information. And we can we can like either do the same with the upper arms and or add the information for like the deltoid and have that sort of like pop through. There are many. This is all of these are ways to interpret the figure. So you can have, it's sort of like build your own adventure when you pull stuff like this, right? And then I'm not gonna go into detail with the hands because the hands are not like a main structure. And she has this sort of like lovely like curve to the side here of the head. And it sort of like, it follows like the midline of the body. Yeah. Okay. And then there's this big, I could almost do this. Sometimes you can go across with the lines, and then there's this big line here, and then you can represent this, and it would also flow right into the toes there. And then, I will take the note that this, because they're on their tiptoes, this knee is gonna be a lot like higher than the other one, and then we can do this. And in this particular person, there is not that much of a curve, so I can do like a single line and then flare this here. And of course, like if you want to like add the chest, you can. I'm mostly like following the anatomy underneath, which is sort of like the rib cage. And you can add like more information, but this reads on its own as this pose. So all of the information that you add on top is going to sort of like be secondary. But for example, if I wanted to add more information, I would probably use a softer, smaller line, and I would add sort of like, that is the wrong layer. I would add like, I can add the curve of the belly here. And then there's this curve here. It's almost, I can almost make it flow into each other like with this almost like infinity sign. That is something that is pretty good. And then you sort of like have this accumulation of the form there, and then here I can add like a lot of like the detail, and then I can go to the belly button, add the breast. I can add all of the interesting little details of the anatomy, you know, like pulling up for the deltoid here, right? And then the important thing is that you think about the flow, and you think about like the motility of like what you're doing, and then like in her face, you know, I can get this like as a long elongated curve, and I do a shorter curve here and maybe a straight, and then we have like sort of like we can do even there is even like rhythm in her eyebrows. There's like here this and this and this, right? And that's sort of like beautiful interplay. And then when you find things like this that are sort of like there's so much beautiful detail, you know, there's a lot to find that is pretty interesting. And I will now show you like the difference between this. We have a lot more information, and then here we have a lot less information, but it's basically the same thing. We were just adding things that weren't really necessary for the entire thing to read, but now it reads, and it's pretty cool, and it was fun. So here, a lot of times when we so contours, a lot of times when we draw, we are just thinking about the contours because that is sort of like the way that we are taught interchangeably. That we are taught to draw when we're kids, you know, like you have the apple and you're sort of like meant to like make it, that is the worst apple ever, that's a tooth, and you're sort of like meant to just draw like the contour, and that's it. And contours don't exist in real life. The only thing you have is you have edges that are sharp and edges that are soft. And then like you have values, and then what you have like hard edges when there is a transition between two materials that are different. But visually, the only thing you have is like hard and soft edges, and you are assigning contours to a lot of the time the edges, but that isn't like necessarily the type of information that you want to convey a lot of the time. So here I have contour versus midline. Something that is very important for me all the time is whenever, and yeah, if you're drawing a front on like that is completely symmetrical too, you're gonna have that midline, right? The line of symmetry, because humans are bilaterally symmetrical, the line of symmetry goes through the middle of the body, and whenever you have that, it's good to take into consideration where it is so that you can properly line up, you know, things that are gonna be symmetrical on both sides, and keep track of things like twists and turns. It's just healthy to always indicate where that midline is, especially when you have something that isn't symmetrical. So for example, there are a lot of landmarks that follow that midline, the vertebrae, the spine, you know, that is something that follows that midline a lot. And if you want to place something that is like in the center, like a belt buckle, or, you know, just like a tattoo, or maybe you want to place the belly button and it looks a little off, it's probably because you didn't indicate your midline, which is a cardinal sin, I would say. And here you can see, for example, we have her back, right? You can see sort of like the twist of her back right here, and then right? So a lot of the things that you want to indicate are sometimes going to have to do with lines within the body that are not contours, or outside contours for that matter, right? And I would, you know, if I had to draw her, I would always try to indicate that midline because there's a twist here, right? So we would have that sort of shape of the back, right? And it's sort of like doing that. And then the line of the hip, the line of the arm and the shoulder, right? And we have this line here, and then I can do the entire leg with this one. We're gonna have her head, yeah, and then we're gonna want to indicate the midline there, because her body's gonna be turning, so it's gonna look like an S shape there. And like this, I can find the gluteus and the rest of her anatomy, and I indicate whatever I find is the most important, which can be subjective, although sometimes it's a lot easier. You know, she's off balance because he's holding her, of course. And I will move this a little bit. And then I can add sort of like this arm, which is the main component of the way she's being held. Right there, and then there's his head and his arm, and now that I've placed this, I can move sort of like the positioning of her arm to be more accurate, right? And I can go again with that oop, oop, oop of the leg. You're usually gonna find it exactly like that. And there you go. So if you have times, like, of course this is not the most accurate, I'm live. Whatever you do live is not gonna be good. Something that is also useful when you're doing something like this, and for example I'm gonna use this in order to do a lot of like correcting, is the, okay, so now what do we have here when it comes to negative space, right? A really good way to measure whether things you're drawing are proportional or not is to consider where things aren't. So if like this is the side of his body and this is his arm, there is that like space there, and then for example I know now that her hip is more to the side. Sorry, because you have that here, and then her leg I've drawn like all the way too close, because you can see he's there and there is a significant amount of space, right? And that is how you sort of like self-correct when you don't have all of the time in the world. And yeah, you can like we can indicate midlines. We can have lines that are sort of like flowing and connecting inside of the body like that. You know? Like it's not necessary that what you're drawing is a contour, but like then if you want to add this, you can add that later. You can actually make it flow into the back of her calf like that. So it is not actually, sometimes it looks more appealing or more beautiful when you do that. For example, here we can just go here and it creates that sort of like very beautiful sort of shape. So there are a lot of ways to represent figures that are flowing and that have a sense of shape and of movement, and that is sort of like the core of gesture. Now we're gonna talk about something that I see a lot of students do, and it's not wrong. Definitely, some people that are some really good artists do this, but I sort of like want them to know that there are different ways to work. When you have limbs, a lot of people, when they have limbs and they're doing a gesture drawing, they sort of like, okay, here is the elbow, here's the shoulder, and then here's the elbow, and then here is the wrist, and then I position them together like this, right? And they're gonna do the same with that other arm. So they're gonna have, okay, so here is the shoulder, and here is the elbow, and here is the wrist, and I position it together like that. And the same with the legs. Not wrong technically, but there are other ways to find rhythm between or inside of limbs. And it's not my idea is that you know that it's not necessary. Even there is a difference between, sorry, I'm gonna drink a little bit because it's really hot in my country. There is a difference between drawing what you see and what you think you see, right? A lot of the time, I think both are. You should probably do both. You should probably draw what you see and draw what you think you see, and then you can also draw an interpretation of what you see, right? So, for example, when I'm pulling lines and I am doing an interpretation of like the inside rhythm of someone's anatomy, and that may not be there, you know, that is sort of like I am adding. You know, it's like not in the visual information, but I am adding sort of like a my own representation of it. But I think that when it comes to drawing, there's a lot of drawing what you think you see, and a lot of the times people overestimate joints. And when you're doing gesture drawings, for example, you want to draw the relationship between different body parts. And for example, instead of you being like, okay, so this is the chest, right? There is something about drawing with geometrical shapes that, you know, it's good, it works, but it's also very funnily enough disjointed, or it's a lot of information. It's not bad, like building blocks, and especially like if you go 3D, there's a lot of things that you can surmise, right? But of course it doesn't have any of like flowing characteristics that I was talking about, that is the idea of gesture. And sort of like you can see sort of like clearly that the idea of gesture here is like this curve here, and then you have this curve here. So instead of thinking, okay, I have the clavicle here, and I know that the clavicle sprouts the deltoid, and the deltoid has 3 heads and sort of like anchors here, and then here's the pectoral, so I draw that. And then, okay, I have like sort of like the elongated head of the bicep, and I know that it's bulkier at the bottom. And then there's the tricep, and the tricep has like that flat part near the elbow. And then there's like, okay, that's a lot. And if you do that, you're probably gonna take 15 years. It's not wrong, it's good, but in gesture drawing, you want to prioritize the gesture of the drawing. So for example, here you could like get away with a curve, you know, just the chest, right? Could get away with like the curve, and then you can like go in and like add the rest. You could have this also be like its own curve like that. You could of course also do this and then 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 do this. A lot of people do it. I would say this is probably the most like correct way to do the gesture, but there are a lot of instances where when you have arms that are flexed, you can just go for the outside of the arm like this, and then like you can add, you know, you can add other details. But there are many moments where the arms can just like be a curve, and then if you want, you can add those like straight bits to like have a little bit more like of an idea of what's happening. So that you start to think about the flow inside of like every sort of like person. So I would go here, and then I would sort of like find this here. They would do that curve there in the leg, and then you have this here, and it flows. And here too, you could do this. You could do this, and then the other curve. So there are different, and there's this beautiful tilt here, and we can like cross the body again. It's not necessary to. So like you can add this later. There are many ways that you can interpret the body, and it should serve the function that you want to, the main idea that you want to work with. Of course, I'm much more efficient, and I'm much more like I am doing this as if it was easy, because I am drawing on top of like the body so that you can see, so that my lack of skill doesn't get in the way of my of the idea that I'm teaching, right? But you have that, right? So if you have the main idea here being like the torsion and this tension and this sort of like idea, then that is something that you could also like arguably you could also go like this. There are a lot of ways that you can interpret bodies that are super cool, and so that is my idea of limb break. You can represent limbs. You can represent limbs very in a way that is like more compact. You could just like do the curves like this and just have that limb represented, and like this too, and you could have that limb represented. You don't have to build everything robotically, because you are going to prioritize gesture when you do a gesture drawing. More lovely ideas. So you're going to a lot of the time find something that is called contrapposto, where there is an opposite tilt of the right, of the body. Basically, contrapposto is when the hips have an angle and the shoulders have a different angle, and that is immediately gonna construct the gesture that we want. Right, so one of the most important things also too is finding the center of gravity. Usually if like a person isn't leaning on something, you can find a center of gravity by dragging down a line from the pit of the collarbone pit. You can go down, boop, through the center of the body, and it's there. So you can see like usually, not always, but usually, in order to rest, humans I say as if it wasn't, but humans will lock their joints, so lock their legs, so the weight it's not your muscles that are working, it's your skeletal structure that is locked together, and that's that column that you lean on. And they're gonna choose one limb to bear the weight. So usually you have one mainly weight-bearing limb, especially if you have a contrapposto, right? So it's this one, because our center of gravity is gonna be closer to that limb that is weight-bearing. And also, depending on like where muscle and fat accumulates in your body, the center of gravity is like lower or higher. So yeah. So you have that. And this is like pretty useful to like have figures not look like they're falling over because you start finding like the balance, right? So interesting and important. And then almost automatically when you have that sort of like contrapposto, you're gonna have the weight-bearing hip pop out, right? The inside of the knee, and then the outside of the leg, that long muscle, because in the inside you have that short muscle there, and then another curve. Good. And then we immediately have you're always gonna have this, almost always gonna have that curve there, but usually you have that opposite curve all the way here. And then the other side, of course, this side of her hip is gonna be up, and this side is gonna be down, because we already have established that there is a tilt here. So you're gonna have this, right? And then you're gonna also have like again the back, sort of like the back of the leg, of the lower leg, and the front of the upper leg with that quadriceps is gonna do that. And then you can like link different elements of the body. You can link the belly if you want, and a lot of other stuff. And sometimes if the limbs aren't doing much for the pose, or they're not adding like important information to the body, and you have 30 seconds to do something, you can leave the limbs out, or you can leave the head out. Here the head sort of like has like this heavy sort of like gesture here. And then a lot of time, if you want to like indicate that there is a plane that is tilted up, for example, here it's described by the underneath here of the, you can also do sort of like a cross section, and that's gonna be indicating where that body part is leaning pretty accurately. So you can do that to like inform sort of like what your viewer is seeing. That's the other one. Boop. So you can inform what the viewer is seeing a lot more with those like sort of like cross section. Yippee! Okay, and now we are gonna be wrapping up in a little bit. So I want to talk about that moment when you get a long pose. And that means this is a pose that takes 10 minutes or more, right? So when you're gonna find that like you're gonna do like a 5-minute or a 5 minute or a 2 minute, and then you're gonna jump into 10 minutes and you're gonna be like, oh my god. And probably at first you're gonna be doing like the same thing that you do always, and you're gonna like try to sort of like get your stuff done like as quick as possible, because like time is ticking, and life is like leaving you, you know, and you're getting old, so you're gonna try to get things down as quickly as possible. And then you're gonna be like, oh my god, I have 9 minutes left, and this doesn't look accurate or good, and I have 9 minutes left. I'm like, what the heck do I do? Okay, here are some things that you can do before you start drawing. So, when you have 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, it's like, okay, I have to get the like my goddamn pen has to be on the paper, my god. But here you can stop and you can think. And you can think what do I want to represent? I probably want to represent the curve of the body, and I want to represent the tension in her arms. And then that change of plane here where you have the front plane of her body and then the side plane of her body that is here, right? And then this, trying to do this as elegantly as possible, and it's gonna be really hard. So we already know what we're gonna do. Okay, so that is our priority. So we're not gonna be focusing a lot on like the toes and the face. Cool. And now we have to think about measures, right? Measurements. Okay, what do I know just from seeing this? Okay, the fist is at the same level of the chin, right? And then we have this sort of like barrier here where there's this alignment here. Cool. And then the midway upper forearm is the top of her head. And then her head is like right here, so it sort of like is within the confines of the body. And in this here height, we have like midway, we have the knee, and then here this is like right here, and then you start sort of like taking measurements, you know, like okay, the width of the head, there's like another width here, and then a little bit more than that. You can start this, and then you have like a lot, you know, angles to think of, and you start thinking about the angles, and you start analyzing this specific pose, because you're gonna spend 10 minutes trying to succinctly portray it, right? So whenever you try to make marks down, you are going to think about the most specific way, and sometimes you make your mark, you stop and think, you make your next mark, you stop and think, you try to portray the next element of her body, and then you think, because you have 10 long minutes, and maybe 10 minutes isn't that much for you. I am the fastest drawer, I know, I don't know how or why, so I really have to think. Then I have that here. Because you have more time and you have to be more accurate, it is possible that you're gonna end up with a figure that is a little stiffer, right? Just as when you do your line art and you're like, my sketch was so much more fluid. Okay, so we have that there. This here. And then we represented the top of the deltoid there. And the other side here. I also want to make sure that the front plane and the side planes are well represented. Well represented as well as you can represent them in this amount of time. Then I don't usually erase, but this is the moment you're like, okay, I can really try to get this as accurately as possible. And then so midway through here we have this. And then you are going to be very sort of like mindfully working on this piece, because you have 10 minutes and you're probably drawing really fast already, right? So what's gonna happen is you don't want to be like, okay, I finished like 14 minutes ago, because then you're not using your time like in the most efficient of ways. And this should be here. And again, mistakes bound to happen. We're going for the least amount of mistakes possible, but bound to happen, and you simply have to go to the next one. So, eventually, you're gonna have something that you're happy with and does not look like this, right? And that is where, when you have something that is like much more advanced, you're gonna think about certain questions of that you weren't thinking before, you know, because you didn't have time of depth. So you may want to like work on like the occlusion shadows, you know, here or here. And then maybe like you want to do that indication of the shape here and there. And you want to have like smaller sections of the anatomy show up more. Another thing that you can do when you have like really long studies is you can do 2 5-minute studies of the same pose, and try to do a different method or have a different approach. For example, something that I really like to do a lot is I do single line studies where I have a single line, obviously, and usually this is where proportions sort of like are really hard, but I sort of like really like to sort of like give it a try and see if I can just like with a single flowing meandering line have a representation of what's going on. And sometimes it goes well and sometimes it's hard. These are pretty good for like flow and then like becoming more confident in what you want to do and like your shapes. There we go, and there we go. So that is something that you can definitely do. And then you can also be like, okay, if I had to draw this with like 10 lines, you know, what would I do? You can even have sort of like more of these, and you could have different things represented in them. So, you know, there are many ways to tackle one of these longer studies that are pretty interesting because you have time to do the things that you couldn't. But the first thing, as always, the first thing that you should be doing is focusing on the gesture, because it is a gesture drawing session. Because of course you could focus on different things. For example, you could do a study of this and you could only focus on the shadows. So you could like be drawing all of the shadow shapes only, right? So that's a hidden layer. You could just like be, you know, working on the shadow shapes. I don't think this is like the best reference to do that with, but you know, that is something that you could be doing. It is very important to be mindful of what you are studying, and what you want out of that study before you start, you know? If you don't already have like a task, like always think about your task. That's gonna make it like way easier. Specific task, specific things that you have to think of. You know, like you're not gonna think about the toes here. You're not gonna think about the texture here. You're gonna think about whatever your studies. And a lot of people take this for granted, and a lot of people are like, okay, I'm making a study of something, then I just have to like throw everything at it. And sometimes you're studying color, right? So if the proportion is a little off, it's fine, because it's not what you're studying. Or you're studying proportion, so you can do black and white, you know, you can do grayscale, and if the color is off, it doesn't matter. Doing focus studies is usually more successful because you're only, you're only working on a single thing. And that can be pretty successful, because you're sort of like owning it. And that would be it for today, folks. Hopefully you will be less worried about tackling this from now on. I would love if you could find like a specific, like a technique that you can apply, trying out these techniques and like these approaches. And if you could find something that brings the enjoyment of it your way, because I feel like the most important thing is that you enjoy the process of making, because then you're gonna be way more excited about actually making, and it won't matter if what you make is perfect or not. Learning is a messy process, and sometimes stuff does not look good. It's not gonna be in your portfolio. It's not a portfolio piece, so it's just for you to practice. So the self-judgment can be left outside of the room, out the door. So this has been really good, and I will see you in the next one.